You know, usually when we think about the transfer of supreme political power, there's like this expectation of a really clear, universally understood rule book.
Right, like a constitution.
Exactly. If you look at a modern democracy, the mechanics are just right there out in the open. You count the votes, someone concedes, and the keys to the office are handed over in broad daylight.
Yeah, it's a process designed to basically survive the people who are participating in it.
Right. The institution is the star, but then, you step into the world of ancient Rome, specifically its very first imperial dynasty, and suddenly you realize that rulebook is just, well, it's completely on fire.
Oh, absolutely in ashes.
We're looking at a political landscape that is murky, it's incredibly violent, and above all, it relies entirely on a colossal public lie.
It is the absolute definition of institutional muddy waters.
Yeah.
I mean, you were talking about a system where the very existence of an emperor is something everyone just has to pretend isn't happening.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, you and I are unpacking a massive stack of sources. We've got historical articles, encyclopedia entries, and extensive video transcripts, and they are all focused on one extraordinary, deeply dysfunctional family.
It's Julio-Claudian Dynasty.
Yep. The family that ruled the Roman Empire from 27 BC to AD 68. We're talking Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, like the heavy hitters.
The first 5 emperors of Rome.
Yeah.
I mean, the men who defined what an emperor even was.
Exactly. And our mission today, as we go through this, is to unpack the central historical tension of this family. Like, how did they seize absolute power while pretending they were just humble civil servants protecting a republic?
Right, the grand illusion.
And how do they desperately try to manufacture legitimacy when there was literally no legal throne to pass down to their kids? And finally, how did their own paranoia and incredibly toxic family dysfunction caused their whole catastrophic decline?
It is a fascinating trajectory.
Yeah.
But before we get into the assassinations and the scandals and, the poisoned mushroom.
The fun stuff.
Right, the wild stuff. We absolutely have to acknowledge the lenses through which we are viewing this history.
Right.
We are navigating through the deeply ingrained biases of ancient senatorial historians.
Right. Guys like Tacitus and Suetonius.
Exactly, and later Cassius Dio. These were men of the elite class,
Right.
like an aristocratic class that had been systematically stripped of its traditional republican power by these very emperors. So we really have to sift through their bitter, often sensationalized accounts to find the structural reality of an empire that was transitioning from a collapsing republic into a global superpower.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this isn't just ancient trivia to memorize, For you listening, if you've ever watched a powerful family business tear itself apart from the inside, or if you've ever wondered how fragile political institutions can be when they are manipulated by charismatic leaders, this dynasty is the ultimate blueprint.
Oh, without a doubt.
It is the definitive story of how human flaws shape world-altering institutions.
Absolutely. The Julio-Claudians didn't just rule, they really set the permanent template for absolute power in the West.
So let's wind the clock back to the beginning. Before we get into the mad emperors making their horses consuls, we have to understand the sheer genius and, well, the fatal flaw of how this entire dynastic house of cards was built.
Yeah.
Because they didn't just march an army into Rome, sit on a throne, and declare themselves kings. The Romans, culturally despised kings.
They hated them.
Yeah, they had violently overthrown their kings centuries prior and built their entire identity on being a republic. So the founder of this dynasty had to play a much, much more sophisticated game.
He did. And, to understand the mechanics of that game, you really have to look at the sheer trauma that the Roman state had just endured. The Republic hadn't just been struggling, it had been tearing itself apart in horrific civil wars for decades.
Just constant bloodshed.
Constant. And it culminated with the assassination of the dictator Julius Caesar in 44 BC. And into that massive power vacuum steps Caesar's great-nephew and posthumously adopted son.
Right, an 18-year-old kid named Gaius Octavius.
Yes, who we eventually come to know as Augustus. But first, he has to win a brutal, multi-front civil war against Caesar's assassins, and then another one against his own former ally, Mark Antony and Cleopatra.
Right, which all comes to a head at the naval battle of Actium in 31 BC. Octavian wins, Antony and Cleopatra are gone. Egypt is completely annexed, pouring just unbelievable wealth into Octavian's personal pockets.
It made him richer than the state itself.
And he is left as the undisputed, solitary master of the Mediterranean world. He has all the armies, he has all the money.
But here's the critical institutional pivot, and really where his genius lies. Octavian is brilliant enough to realize that if he acts like a king, or if he declares himself dictator for life the way Julius Caesar did.
The Senate will literally stab him to death.
Exactly, right on the Senate floor. Military victory isn't enough. He needs a legal framework. So in 27 BC, he engineers what historians call the Principate.
Which is such a weird setup.
It is. He literally goes to the Senate in this highly choreographed piece of political theater and says, the crisis is over. I am restoring the Republic. I am giving up my emergency powers and handing the state back to the Senate and the people of Rome.
But he doesn't actually give up anything, does he?
Not at all. It's a masterful, systemic illusion. The Senate, supposedly out of overwhelming gratitude, begs him to stay.
Shocker.
Right. And they grant him the honorific title Augustus, which means the illustrious or the revered one. But structurally, if you look at what he keeps, it's wild. He maintains direct control over the massive frontier provinces.
Which just so happen to be where all the heavily armed legions are stationed.
Exactly. It's no coincidence.
Yeah.
And over time, he is granted tribunician podestas, or tribunician power for life.
Okay, so wait, what does that actually let him do on a daily basis?
Oh, it is the ultimate administrative trump card. It allows him to introduce legislation, convene the Senate, and most importantly, veto absolutely any action by any magistrate in Rome. Yeah, and furthermore, he's granted imperium maius, which is supreme military command over every other general. So he brilliantly maintains the facade of the Republic. The Senate still meets, consuls are still elected, courts still function, while he is hoarding all the actual levers of hard power.
But in public, he refuses kingly titles.
Right, he simply calls himself princeps, meaning the first citizen.
I love looking at the PR campaign he ran alongside this institutional takeover, because it wasn't just about hoarding legal powers, right? It was about totally reshaping the culture to make his rule seem inevitable and, natural and blessed by the gods.
Yes, the symbolism was everywhere.
He's operating on a symbolic level that is just staggering. The sources mention that Augustus claimed to have built or restored 82 temples in a single year.
82. It's almost unbelievable.
He's physically rebuilding Rome in marble and positioning himself as the savior of traditional Roman morality and religion. And he's heavily patronizing the arts, too. He basically commissions the poet Virgil to write the Aeneid.
The great Roman epic.
Yeah, this epic blockbuster of a poem, specifically to tie Rome's destiny and his own family's destiny directly back to the gods.
Yes, the cultural reset is incredibly comprehensive. This is the dawn of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. He's offering a very specific social contract to the people. He's basically saying, I brought you peace, I ended the civil wars, I brought you the gods' favor. Just let me handle the administration.
And the people take it.
They do. They are exhausted by decades of bloodshed, so they are largely willing to take that deal. They trade their political liberty for stability.
And even the name of the dynasty is a crucial part of this massive PR effort, like the Julio-Claudian Dynasty. It's a calculated merger of two incredibly prestigious ancient patrician clans.
Oh, the branding was immaculate.
On one side, you have the Julia. That's Augustus's family through his adoption by Julius Caesar. This is a family that literally traces its lineage back to Aeneas, the legendary founder of Rome, and through him directly to the goddess Venus herself. I mean, you can't buy that kind of brand equity.
You really can't. And then, on the other side, you have the Claudi. They're brought in through Augustus's second wife, Livia Drusilla, and her sons from a previous marriage.
The old money.
Exactly. The Claudis were one of the oldest, most fiercely aristocratic and traditionally powerful families in the Roman Republic. So by marrying Livia and eventually adopting her son Tiberius, Augustus merges the divine populist prestige of the Julii with the ancient, conservative, aristocratic weight of the Claudi.
It's like a corporate merger designed to completely monopolize the political market. Actually, I was thinking about this as I was reading through the sources. Augustus operates exactly like a modern shadow CEO.
A shadow CEO. How exactly does that map onto ancient Rome?
Think about the mechanics of it. He publicly steps down from the executive role. He says, I'm just a shareholder now. He lets the board of directors, which is the Senate, sit at the big mahogany table, pass memos around, debate infrastructure, and feel deeply important.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
But secretly, he owns 100% of the voting shares. And more importantly, he personally pays the salaries of the building's entire security team, the frontier legions.
Right, the guys with the swords.
Yeah. The board can talk and argue all they want, but no one is leaving that boardroom and no real decisions are executed unless he unlocks the door.
That is a shockingly accurate institutional summary of the Principate. He owned the security team, and he controlled the capital flow.
Hmm.
The Senate was allowed to govern the pacified interior provinces, sure, but Augustus held the perimeter and the sword.
But this brings up a huge contradiction. By pretending the Republic still existed, by insisting he was just a first citizen and acting like a shadow CEO, didn't Augustus accidentally create the exact succession crisis that ultimately doomed his whole family?
Oh, absolutely.
Because if there is no official legal throne, there's nothing to officially pass down to an heir, right? You can't put shadow
Yeah.
CEO in your will.
You have hit on the fatal structural flaw of the entire Julio-Claudian system right there. Because Rome is supposedly still a republic, the law of primogeniture, the automatic legal passing of a crown from a father to his eldest son, it simply does not exist.
It's illegal, basically.
It is completely alien to Roman law. You cannot legally bequeath an empire that legally claims it isn't an empire.
Mm.
So Augustus had to somehow pass on his informal influence, his massive personal wealth, his tribunician powers, and most importantly, the loyalty of the legions to a successor, without ever making it look like a monarchical succession.
And it becomes a total nightmare for him. It's like a cursed bloodline right from the start. He's desperately trying to groom heirs, and the universe just keeps saying no.
It truly was a biological tragedy that turned into a political crisis. Augustus had no biological sons, only a single daughter, Julia, so he relied heavily on adoption, which is, a very common legally binding Roman practice. But every single time he groomed a young, popular relative from the Julian side of the family, someone who shared his divine blood.
They died. Every single one.
First, his beloved nephew Marcellus dies at age 19 of an illness. Then, Augustus marries his daughter Julia to his top general and closest friend, Agrippa. They have boys, Gaius and Lucius. Augustus officially adopts them. They are the golden boys of Rome, paraded around, given titles early.
And then they both die in their early 20s while on military deployments under highly suspicious circumstances within 18 months of each other.
Exactly. It's devastating for him. So Augustus, now aging and running out of options out of sheer biological necessity, is forced to turn to his stepson Tiberius, a Claudian.
The backup plan.
Right. Tiberius is a brilliant general, an incredibly accomplished man, but Augustus clearly didn't want him as his first choice. He was just the last man standing. And the human tragedy of it is that to make the succession work, to lock Tiberius into the Julian family tree, Augustus forces Tiberius to divorce his wife, Vipsania.
Which is just awful.
It really is. This was a woman Tiberius deeply, passionately loved, and they had a child together. Augustus forces him to abandon her and marry Augustus's own daughter, Julia, and Julia openly despised Tiberius.
It's brutal. The sources have this incredibly poignant detail where Tiberius once saw his ex-wife Vipsania in the street long after the divorce, and he followed her, weeping uncontrollably, until Augustus's agents had to intervene and make sure they never physically crossed paths again.
It's heartbreaking.
Augustus literally broke a man's heart to secure a political alliance, forcing this reluctant, grieving stepson into the spotlight to inherit a shadow empire that legally didn't even exist.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the psychological and institutional disaster of our next phase. Augustus dies in 14 AD. The Senate, terrified of another civil war, immediately transfers all those complex legal powers to Tiberius. The system holds. But the man holding the reins is fundamentally different.
Right, so Augustus built a system that relied entirely on the illusion of Republican norms and his own personal, magnetic, backslapping charisma. He was the ultimate politician. So what happens when the guy who inherits the company absolutely hates the spotlight, despises the politicians, and refuses to play along with the charade?
You get a very grim transition from golden age PR to bureaucratic isolation and intense paranoia. But, before we get to the bloodshed that defines his reign, we absolutely must view Tiberius through the lens of political administration.
Okay, fair.
Despite the terrible, tyrannical reputation ancient historians give him, Tiberius was a deeply competent, highly effective administrator.
He wasn't a showman, though. He wasn't building 82 temples a year.
No, he despised the flattery of the Senate. When they tried to vote him the divine honors that Augustus had accepted, he often refused them. He hated the games, he hated the public spectacles, but he understood the machinery of empire.
Right.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, he chose diplomacy over costly, risky wars. Instead of expanding the borders to win personal glory, he secured the existing borders in Germany and the East. And from a purely fiscal standpoint, he was an absolute genius.
He left a ton of money, right?
When he died, he left a staggering 3 billion sesterces in the state treasury. He was keeping the empire running flawlessly on a macro level. The provinces actually thrived under Tiberius.
But on a micro level, specifically inside the city of Rome, the atmosphere was completely toxic. You have this highly competent bureaucrat, but he's surrounded by a Senate that resents him for not being Augustus, and an aristocratic class constantly plotting to replace him. And this is where we have to talk about the treason trials, or the Maiestas trials, because this is how the autocracy maintained its grip.
Yes. The institutional mechanics of these trials are terrifying, and it's vital to understand how they functioned. To protect himself against plots, Tiberius, and increasingly his praetorian prefect, his head of security, a man named Sejanus, expanded the legal definition of treason.
It wasn't just armed rebellion anymore.
No, treason could be a disrespectful comment about the emperor at a dinner party, or consulting an astrologer about the emperor's horoscope, and they incentivized the prosecution of these crimes through a system of informers, known as the delators.
Here's where it gets really interesting and frankly horrifying. The informers weren't government agents, they were private citizens. And they got a cut of the accused person's property if they successfully secured a conviction in the Senate.
Exactly. Imagine the psychological impact of that. It created a horrific financial incentive to falsely accuse your wealthy neighbors, your political rivals, or even your family members of plotting against the emperor.
It's like monetized paranoia.
Yes. If a senator was found guilty and executed, his estate was confiscated. The emperor took a share, and the informer took a share, often a quarter of the entire estate. It created an atmosphere of utter terror among the senatorial elite. Slaves were tortured to give false testimony against their masters. No one was safe. You could literally monetize your neighbor's execution.
And as this paranoia peaks, as the trials are ramping up, Tiberius just leaves. He completely checks out. He retreats to the island of Capri in 26 AD and essentially never comes back to Rome.
He's done with the city.
He governs by letter. And according to the historian Suetonius, he spends his time on this heavily fortified island engaging in these legendary, twisted, horrific debaucheries.
Now, we should definitely take Suetonius with a grain of salt here. He absolutely loved scandalous, salacious rumors to make emperors look bad, but the actual political reality was devastating regardless. By physically isolating himself on Capri, Tiberius left the day-to-day running of Rome to his praetorian prefect, Sejanus.
And Sejanus is the ultimate villain of this era. Talk about family bloodshed. While Tiberius is hiding on an island, reading reports and balancing the budget, Sejanus is systematically wiping out the imperial family to clear his own path to the throne.
He really wanted to be the next emperor.
The sources indicate Sejanus actually seduced the wife of Tiberius's own biological son, Drusus, and together they poisoned Drusus.
It was a shocking breach of the dynasty's security, and because Tiberius was isolated, Sejanus controlled the mail. He controlled the narrative. After murdering Tiberius's son, Sejanus then went after the extremely popular line of Germanicus, who was Tiberius's deceased nephew and a beloved general.
Right, the Golden family.
Sejanus managed to feed Tiberius false reports, eventually getting Germanicus's widow, Agrippina the Elder, and her two eldest sons arrested. They were exiled and eventually killed or starved to death in prison.
So wait, I have to challenge this. You called Tiberius a competent administrator because he balanced the budget and secured the borders. But wasn't he essentially an absentee landlord who let his property manager murder his own tenants? I mean, he let his security chief murder his own son and his nephews. How can a dynasty maintain any shred of legitimacy when the emperor is hiding on an island and his heirs are being slaughtered by his own employee?
That is the exact vulnerability of the system Augustus built. An autocracy is only as stable and effective as the information reaching the autocrat. Because Tiberius bypassed the Senate and relied on a single point of failure, Sejanus, he was completely isolated from the truth. The institutions of the Republic were meant to provide checks and balances, but the Principate destroyed those.
So it's a structural failure.
Precisely. However, in 31 AD, a letter finally smuggles its way to Tiberius on Capri, exposing the plot. Tiberius moves brilliantly. He smuggles a letter of his own to the Senate, completely surprising Sejanus, who thinks he's about to be given more power. Instead, the letter orders Sejanus' immediate execution. A massive bloody purge follows.
But you could argue the damage to the brand is already done.
Absolutely. The facade of the Republic was totally shattered. The people in the Senate saw clearly that real power didn't lie in the Senate House or in the laws or in the title of first citizen. It lay in violence, paranoia, and the swords of the Praetorian Guard.
Which brings us to a massive transition point. It's 37 AD. Tiberius finally dies at the age of 77. There's actually a rumor he fell into a coma, woke up, and was promptly smothered with a pillow by his own Praetorian Guard to speed things along.
A very Roman succession.
Right. And the Senate and the people of Rome are absolutely thrilled because they are getting a young, fresh face. The sole surviving son of the beloved General Germanicus, the one son Sejanus didn't manage to kill. He's got direct Julian blood through his mother, direct Claudian blood through his father. His real name is Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, better known to history by his childhood nickname, Caligula.
The Little Boot, a nickname given to him by the soldiers when he was a toddler in the army camps. And his ascension brings us to the dynasty's first, truly catastrophic crisis of legitimacy.
Okay, let's unpack Caligula, because everyone listening probably knows the legends of his madness. And the sources tell us that for the first 6 months, he was the golden boy.
He was incredibly popular.
He stopped the treason trials, he recalled exiles, he paid massive cash bonuses to the army, he put on lavish gladiatorial games. But then he falls seriously ill. He nearly dies. And when he recovers, it's like a switch flipped in his brain. He wakes up as a monster.
The ancient sources, again, Suetonius and Cassius Dio, they certainly portray a dramatic clinical personality shift, yes.
It's the stuff of nightmares. He burns through that massive 3 billion sesterces surplus that Tiberius spent a lifetime hoarding, and he does it in just a year.
Fast worker.
This forces him to invent ridiculous taxes just to fund his excesses, taxing prostitutes, taxing lawsuits. He executes people with sadistic delight. Cassius Dio specifically writes that it wasn't just the political murders, it was his insatiable desire for the sight of blood. He forces parents to watch their children be executed. He famously marches his legions to the coast of Gaul, supposedly to invade Britain, and then inexplicably orders them to collect seashells as plunder from the ocean.
The famous seashell incident.
And of course, the most famous story of all, threatening to make his beloved racehorse Incitatus a Roman consul.
Right. And here is where I must actively push back against this dramatic Hollywood narrative of sheer insanity. We really have to engage in some serious source analysis. This raises an important question. Who wrote these accounts? The senatorial elite. They deeply despised emperors who stripped them of their dignity. And Caligula didn't just strip them of power, he actively humiliated them.
Are you saying Caligula wasn't mad? Threatening to put a horse in the Senate isn't mad?
I'm saying modern historical scholarship reassesses him significantly, looking at his actions as a political strategy rather than pure clinical psychosis. Consider his actual administrative policies. Initially, he restored democratic elections to the assemblies, a massive populist move that terrified the Senate. He abolished the treason trials, at least for a while. He finished crucial, pragmatic building projects that Tiberius had neglected, like expanding the harbor at Rhegium to secure the grain supply.
Okay, but the horse.
Right. As for the madness, let's look at the context of the horse. When he threatened to make Incitatus a consul, was he hallucinating that the horse was a man? Or was he a 25-year-old absolute autocrat deliberately mocking an aristocratic Senate that had become entirely useless and sycophantic? He was essentially saying, your ancient, revered political office is so meaningless now that my horse could do your job just as well as you do.
So it wasn't a delusion, it was a devastating political insult. He was an incredibly arrogant young man who loved trolling the establishment.
Exactly. He demanded to be treated as a living god, forcing senators to prostrate themselves. That's not insane in the context of Hellenistic monarchs, it's just deeply un-Roman. And the seashells incident. Most historians today suggest it was the result of a military mutiny. Yeah, the soldiers refused to cross the dangerous English Channel to Britain. So Caligula, unable to slaughter his own army, humiliated them instead. He ordered them to pick up shells as spoils of the sea instead of winning actual glory and gold. It's cruel, it's erratic, and it's terrible leadership, but it is a rational punishment within the context of a mutiny. It isn't necessarily clinical insanity.
Okay, I see the distinction. But whether he was clinically insane or just a cruel troll wielding absolute unchecked power, he crossed a line. You can only humiliate the people guarding you for so long.
Very true.
And that leads to the major turning point of the entire Julio-Claudian era, January 24th, 41 AD. Caligula is assassinated in a dark tunnel beneath the palace while leaving the theater. But here's the critical part, the structural shift. It wasn't a senatorial debate that brought him down. It wasn't a rival politician. It was the Praetorian Guard. His own bodyguards hacked him to death, along with his wife, and they even smashed his infant daughter against a wall.
It was an absolute institutional earthquake. For the first time in Roman history, the military realized they didn't just protect the emperor. They had the physical capacity to create or destroy the emperor.
They figured out they were the kingmakers.
Exactly. The Senate, hearing of Caligula's death, rushed to the capital and literally debated restoring the republic. They thought, the tyrant is dead, let's bring back democracy. But the Praetorian Guard realized a horrifying truth. If the republic is restored, there is no emperor. And if there is no emperor, an elite imperial bodyguard unit has no jobs, no massive bonuses, and no power.
Right, they'd be out of work.
So they decided they needed to find their own emperor immediately to force the Senate's hand.
Which is such a wild pivot. The military says, no, we're keeping the dictatorship because the pay is too good. And while the Praetorians are literally looting the imperial palace after murdering Caligula, causing total chaos, one of the soldiers spots a pair of feet sticking out from behind a curtain.
They pull the curtain back, and cowering there in terror is Claudius, Caligula's uncle, the brother of the great Germanicus.
He is absolutely terrified. He fully expects to be murdered next because he's part of the bloodline. Now, Claudius was 50 years old. He had a severe limp. He drooled when he was excited. His head shook and he stuttered badly. His own family, including Augustus himself, had kept him hidden from public life for decades because they thought he was a dim-witted embarrassment. His own mother, Antonia, supposedly called him a monster of a man, an unfinished product of nature.
It is a profound irony. But those physical disabilities are exactly what saved his life. During the bloody purges of Sejanus under Tiberius and during the erratic homicidal violence of Caligula, no one ever saw Claudius as a political threat. He survived by being perceived as a harmless idiot.
The ultimate camouflage.
Yes. But the Praetorians didn't care about his limp or his stutter. They needed a Julio-Claudian, any Julio-Claudian, to justify their own institutional existence. So they literally haul him out from behind the curtain, hoist this terrified, disabled 50-year-old man on their shoulders, carry him to their camp, and declare him emperor of Rome.
By all logic, the dynasty should totally collapse right here. A traumatized, unproven man with zero military experience is violently thrust into the ultimate geopolitical pressure cooker by a rogue military unit. Instead, against all odds, his reign sparks the empire's greatest expansion and administrative overhaul. Why? How does he pull that off?
Because beneath the physical disabilities that repulsed the Roman elite, Claudius possessed a brilliant, deeply educated, and incredibly pragmatic mind. He had spent his 50 years of isolation locked in libraries, studying history, law, religion, and administration.
He knew his stuff.
He knew how the Roman state was actually supposed to function. And because the senatorial nobility constantly underestimated him, mocked him, and relentlessly plotted to overthrow him, Claudius realized he couldn't trust them to help him govern. So he bypassed them entirely.
This is where we get into the nuts and bolts of his genius.
Yes. He centralized imperial power by creating a highly professional civil administration. But he didn't staff it with aristocratic senators. He staffed it with highly educated imperial freedmen. These were former slaves who had been freed and now worked in the imperial household.
I want to pause on that because that is a massive shift. You mentioned he bypassed the Senate and used these freedmen. That sounds like he basically invented the modern civil service. But why former slaves? If you're building an empire, why not use the educated aristocratic elite who have been doing this for centuries?
Because, as I mentioned, the aristocratic elite were exactly the people trying to assassinate him. Think about the power dynamics. A Roman senator has his own ancient bloodline, his own massive estates, his own wealth, and his own network of clients. He doesn't need Claudius. His loyalty is split.
Right.
But a freedman, a formerly enslaved person who has been elevated to the apex of the imperial court, owes 100% of their wealth, status, and physical safety directly to the emperor. If the emperor falls, the freedmen fall with him.
Ah, so their loyalty is structurally guaranteed. It's not just a personal preference for Claudius, it's an institutional defense mechanism.
Exactly, and the efficiency was incredible. Claudius divided the government into distinct, specialized bureaus. You had the Arationibus, which handled the imperial finances and taxes, the Ab Epistulus, which handled all imperial correspondence and intelligence across the globe, the Alibulus, handling petitions.
So he's creating departments.
Yes, he effectively centralized the global supply chain and administrative state, stripping the Senate of its administrative relevance. The senators were furious that they had to ask former slaves for favors, but the empire ran smoother than ever.
Which explains how he got massive infrastructure projects done. He builds the massive new harbor at Ostia. Before Claudius, Rome was constantly on the verge of starving to death during the winter because grain ships couldn't dock safely. He guarantees the grain supply. He builds the Aqua Claudia aqueduct, transforming the water supply. But we have to talk about his biggest gamble.
Britain.
Right. Recognizing that he lacked the military prestige required of a Roman emperor, especially in an emperor put in power by the army. He orchestrates a masterstroke, the conquest of Britain in 43 AD.
It was an incredibly audacious move. Julius Caesar had tried to conquer Britain a century earlier and failed, largely retreating. Britain was this mythical, terrifying island on the edge of the known world. But Claudius needs a triumph. He needs military legitimacy to stop the Senate from plotting against him.
So he sends 4 legions under a brilliant general, Aulus Plautius. And once the heady fighting is done and victory is assured, Claudius actually travels to Britain himself. The guy with the limp and the stutter crosses the channel, brings war elephants with him to terrify the locals, and enters the conquered capital of Camalodunum.
It was a strategic and political triumph. It secured immense mineral wealth, a new source of enslaved labor and agricultural land. But most importantly, it secured unquestionable prestige and absolute loyalty from the legions. He returned to Rome and celebrated a massive triumph. He transformed the empire from a Mediterranean hegemony into a true European power.
Okay, so Claudius masters the empire. He conquers Britain, he balances the books, he feeds the city, he builds the bureaucracy. But here's where we pivot to my lens. The incredibly toxic family dynamics.
Oh, yes.
Because while Claudius was an administrative genius on the global stage, he was disastrously outmaneuvered in his own home. He was married 4 times, and his wives essentially ran circles around him.
The role of women in the Julio-Claudian dynasty is arguably its most defining yet misunderstood feature. Because Rome was a deeply patriarchal society, women had no formal institutional power. They couldn't vote, lead armies, or speak in the Senate.
They were totally cut out on paper.
Therefore, highly intelligent, ambitious women had to exert influence through the only avenues available to them: marriage, childbirth, manipulation, and sheer political ruthlessness.
Let's contrast them. You have Livia, Augustus's wife in the beginning of the dynasty. She was the model of Roman propriety in public, spinning her own wool. But behind the scenes, she subtly influenced the succession by outliving everyone and maneuvering her son Tiberius into power.
She was the quiet strategist.
But Claudius's wives, they didn't do subtle. First, you have his 3rd wife, Valeria Messalina. She was decades younger than him. The sources claim she was wildly promiscuous, but politically she was lethal. She allegedly orchestrated the executions of multiple senators and potential rivals. Her downfall comes when she goes too far. She essentially treats her marriage to the emperor as a joke, publicly marrying her lover while Claudius is out of town, seemingly plotting to replace him.
Which was a step too far even for Claudius.
Right. Claudius's freedmen, realizing she's a threat to their own survival, convince him to execute her.
And following her execution, Claudius makes the most fatal mistake of his entire reign. He needs a new wife to shore up his political alliances. So he marries his own niece, Agrippina the Younger.
The incestuous nature of this is wild, even for Rome, right? They had to literally change the law to allow it. Now, Agrippina is the sister of Caligula, the daughter of the great Germanicus. She has impeccable Julian and Claudian royalty flowing through her veins, and she is terrifyingly ambitious. She doesn't just want backroom influence, she wants to rule.
And she's very good at it.
She systematically clears the path for her son from a previous marriage, a boy named Nero, to become the next emperor. She convinces Claudius to adopt Nero, placing him ahead of Claudius's own biological son, Britannicus.
Her grasp on power was truly unprecedented. We have archaeological evidence, actual coins minted during this period, showing Agrippina's face right alongside Nero's face to face.
Wait, really?
Yes. In Roman society, depicting a living woman with such overt shared political authority was staggering. It visually demonstrated that the source of Nero's legitimacy wasn't his own achievements, but his mother's divine bloodline and her ruthless political machinery. She surrounded Nero with loyalists, appointed the philosopher Seneca as his tutor, and put her own man, Burrus, in charge of the Praetorian Guard.
I have to push back here, though. I question your focus on institutions. Doesn't Agrippina prove that all these bureaucratic reforms you're talking about, the bureaus, the freedmen, are basically irrelevant? I mean, Claudius built an entire professional civil service. He conquered Britain. He centralized the law. But Agrippina bypassed absolutely all of it with a plate of poisoned mushrooms.
Well,
in 54 AD, when Claudius starts showing signs of favoring his biological son Britannicus again, Agrippina allegedly feeds Claudius a fatal dose of poison hidden in his favorite dish of mushrooms, ensuring Nero takes the throne immediately. Isn't this still just a glorified mafia family where the institutions only matter until the boss's wife decides it's time for a sudden change in management?
that is a harsh but remarkably accurate assessment of the Julio-Claudian paradox. The bureaucracy functioned perfectly for the empire at large, The aqueduct ran, the taxes were collected, the borders were defended in Germany and Britain. But at the very apex of the pyramid, the transition of supreme power was entirely devoid of any institutional mechanism.
It was just chaos.
It was governed by poison, praetorian bribes, and proximity to the emperor's bedchamber. The system could run the world, but it couldn't regulate itself.
Which brings us to our final act. Agrippina has ruthlessly cleared the path. The Praetorian Guard is paid off. Claudius is dead and deified. And a 16-year-old boy named Nero takes the throne. We've seen this dynasty survive reluctant rulers like Tiberius, erratic trolls like Caligula, and internal assassinations. But Nero introduces a brand new fatal flaw. He alienates the very provinces and armies that physically hold the empire together.
We must look at the arc of Nero's reign, because it wasn't an immediate disaster. In fact, the first 5 years, known as the Quinquennium Neronis, were considered a golden age of stability and good governance.
Really, Nero?
Yes, because Nero wasn't really ruling. He was a teenager interested in poetry. The empire was actually being governed by his highly competent advisors, the Stoic philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, with Agrippina heavily influencing the background politics.
But Nero grows up, and he decides he doesn't want to share power, especially with his overbearing mother. The soap opera turns into a full-blown horror movie. He starts systematically murdering anyone who could challenge his legitimacy. He has his stepbrother, Britannicus, poisoned at a family dinner party, claiming the boy was just having an epileptic seizure while everyone watches him die.
Chilling.
And then he turns on his mother. He eventually orchestrates the murder of Agrippina, which, even by the bloody standards of Rome, was a horrifying religious and social taboo. He famously tried to kill her with a collapsible boat that was designed to sink, and when she swam to shore, he just sent assassins to stab her.
The familial bloodshed reaches its absolute zenith under Nero. He executes his first wife, Octavia, and allegedly kicks his second wife, Poppaea, to death while she was pregnant. But the political and economic unraveling of the dynasty is tied to a specific catastrophic event, the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. A massive inferno burns for nearly a week, destroying or severely damaging 10 of Rome's 14 districts.
And the famous legend is that Nero fiddled while Rome burned.
A legend, largely fabricated later. The fiddle hadn't been invented, for one. And historically, Nero actually enacted massive, highly organized public relief efforts. He opened his own gardens to the homeless and brought in food supplies to prevent starvation. But the sheer cost of rebuilding Rome was astronomical.
Yeah, that's not cheap.
And specifically, the cost of building his extravagant new palace, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, right in the cleared ashes of the city center, completely bankrupted the treasury.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and where the mechanism of his downfall starts turning. To fund this golden house, which had a rotating dining room, a massive artificial lake, and a 100-foot bronze statue of himself, he doesn't just tax the Romans, he heavily taxes the provinces.
The edges of the empire.
Right. The people living in Gaul, in Spain, in Judea, who are providing the wealth and the grain, and while he's taxing them into oblivion, stripping their temples of gold, what is Nero doing? He's obsessed with the arts. He's traveling to Greece, performing in theaters, playing the lyre, competing in chariot races. He forces senators to sit in the theater and watch him perform for hours on end, to the point where men supposedly fake their own deaths just to be carried out.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Nero fundamentally misunderstood the source of his power. Augustus knew the power lay with the legions. Tiberius secured the borders. Claudius conquered Britain. Nero ignored the military, never visiting the troops, and humiliated the traditional elite.
The ultimate disconnect.
The Pisonian conspiracy in 65 AD, a massive plot by senators, knights, and even praetorians to assassinate him, proved that the Senate had lost all legal avenues to enact change and had resorted entirely to murder. But when the conspiracy failed, Nero's paranoia skyrocketed, leading to mass executions of his most competent generals and politicians, including his old tutor Seneca.
I look at Nero like a modern celebrity CEO. You have the founder's great-great-grandson inheriting a massive global corporation that runs on a very tight margin. But instead of managing the logistics, he spends all the company's capital on personal vanity projects. He's doing photo shoots. He's throwing massive parties at corporate headquarters, while completely ignoring the regional branch managers, the provincial governors and generals who actually generate the revenue and hold the perimeter.
Yes.
Eventually, if you bleed the branch managers dry and treat them with contempt, they are going to stage a hostile takeover.
That is precisely the mechanism of his downfall. The heavy taxation and the execution of popular generals triggered fatal revolts. In late 67 or early 68 AD, Julius Vindex, a powerful governor in Gaul, rebels against Nero's tax policies. Now, Vindex doesn't have a massive army, but to gain military backing, he calls on Galba.
The big guns.
Galba is the governor in Hispania, a seasoned, hardened military man with legions at his back. Vindex urges Galba to declare himself the true representative of the Roman people.
And this is the end of the line. The illusion is totally broken. The Senate, seeing that the provincial armies are turning against Nero and marching on Rome, finally finds its courage and officially declares Nero a public enemy. Even the Praetorian Guard in Rome, bribed by their own ambitious prefect, Nymphidius Sabinus, abandons him.
Everyone leaves him.
Nero wakes up in the palace in the middle of the night. His guards are gone, his friends are gone, facing arrest and a brutal execution, being beaten to death in the Forum. Nero flees the city in disguise. With the help of a loyal secretary, he commits suicide. And his famous last words, according to Suetonius, perfectly sum up his delusions. "What an artist dies in me."
With that suicide in June of 68 AD, the Julio-Claudian Dynasty officially ended. But the consequences of how it ended were catastrophic. The lack of an heir plunged the empire into chaos, resulting in the Year of the Four Emperors in 69 AD.
A total mess.
It was a brutal, empire-wide civil war where multiple military commanders marched on Rome to fight for the throne. It definitively proved what Augustus had tried so hard to hide, that the Praetorian Guard and the provincial legions were the true kingmakers, not the Senate. The secret of empire was out.
Which makes me wonder, was it Nero's personal extravagance and cruelty that doomed the dynasty? Or was it simply the biological failure of not producing a legitimate heir that allowed the Year of the Four Emperors to happen? I mean, if Nero had a competent 20-year-old son ready to take over, backed by Agrippina's old political machine, would the provincial governors have even dared to revolt?
Yeah, it's the ultimate debate among historians. I would argue it was a systemic failure baked into the system from day one. The Principate relied on the illusion of a republic, meaning there was no institutional framework for succession. It relied entirely on the charisma, competence, and biological luck of one specific family line to keep the army loyal. When that family failed to produce an heir, and simultaneously Nero alienated the military that upheld their power, the entire facade collapsed. The system demanded a monarch to function, but legally lacked the laws of monarchy to sustain it safely from one generation to the next.
So what does this all mean for us today? Let's bring it home and synthesize the key takeaways. The Julio-Claudians are an incredible historical paradox. On one hand, you have a deeply dysfunctional, paranoid, violent family that poisoned each other at dinner parties and engaged in relentless backstabbing.
Truly toxic.
But on the other hand, they built the most enduring bureaucratic, architectural, and military foundations of the ancient world. They established a professional civil service, expanded the borders into Europe, built infrastructure that is literally still standing today, and initiated 2 centuries of relative peace known as the Pax Romana.
They proved that absolute, centralized power, when wielded by competent administrators, can be incredibly efficient for governing a vast, diverse territory. But they also proved that this same system is inherently fragile and volatile when the transition of that power is inextricably tied to the psychology, the paranoia, and the biological luck of a single bloodline.
Exactly. And to you, the listener, I want to make this direct connection. Whenever you see a modern political movement or like a massive global corporation that relies entirely on the magnetic charisma of its founder rather than the strength of its rules, its bylaws, and its institutions, you are witnessing the ghost of the Julio-Claudian dynasty.
A very apt comparison.
When the rulebook is replaced by personality, the transition of power always inevitably gets messy.
Institutions must be designed to outlive their founders, or they risk descending into the very chaos they were built to prevent.
But I want to leave you with one final haunting detail that I found buried deep in the genealogy charts of our source material, something that really reframes the whole story for me. We always say the dynasty ended with Nero's suicide in 68 AD, but the Julio-Claudian bloodline didn't actually go extinct that day.
No, it did not. Through the female lines, it quietly endured.
Through various granddaughters, nieces, and distant cousins. Women like Junia Calvina or Domitia Longina, who actually became the wife of the Emperor Domitian decades later. The literal blood of Augustus quietly survived for centuries. They married into other aristocratic senatorial families. It even trickled down 100 years later to a man named Avidius Cassius, who tried to usurp the throne in the year 175 AD.
It's amazing how the bloodline persisted.
Imagine that. Imagine being a direct descendant of Augustus Caesar. You are quietly living as an ordinary Roman citizen, watching from the sidelines as brutal civil wars rage, as absolute strangers from different provinces fight over the vast empire that your own family built. What must it have felt like to walk through Rome, surrounded by the marble temples your ancestors raised, possessing the literal blood of gods, but holding the political power of a commoner?
A profound and humbling historical irony. They became spectators in their own empire.
So the next time you look at a clean, orderly transfer of power, someone giving a concession speech, shaking hands, and walking away, remember the muddy, violent waters of Rome's first family. Because keeping that machinery of democracy working, keeping the institutions stronger than the individuals, well, it's a lot harder than it looks. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.